So good evening, everyone. We're going to get started momentarily. We're going to wait for folks to file on in from the waiting room. I do want to note that you do want to click yes to consent to being recorded. You yourselves will not be recorded. Peter and I cannot see you. We cannot hear you. The only recording will be of Peter and his slides. But I did just want you to be aware that when you do join the Zoom, because we're recording, it's going to ask you to consent to being recorded. It's just a funny thing that Zoom does. And I'm expecting a bunch more folks. Sometimes it takes a little while. But for those who are here with us live on Zoom already, why don't you let us know in the chat where you're joining us from? So we'll start in about 30 seconds or so. But for those who are here with us now at the start, let us know in the chat where you're joining us from, what city or town, or even state, and only if you're comfortable doing so. Certainly no pressure. Oh, wonderful, Patricia. Excellent. Thank you, Harriet. Oh, wow. All right, Bonnie. So we have several out-of-staters here for you tonight, Peter. Let's see here. Let's see, Phoenix. I love Phoenix. All right. Okay, well, we're going to have more folks trickle in, but out of respect for those that came on time, we will get started. Just to note that everyone who registered for tonight's event will be receiving an email from me tomorrow morning with a link to a feedback survey. Please fill that out. Let us know what you thought of tonight's event and what you'd like to see for future events. Additionally, you'll be receiving a link to this recording. Feel free to pass it along to anyone in your life who you think may benefit or may be interested in this presentation. Just to set expectations, Peter will speak for roughly 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll take some audience questions. If you have questions for Peter, type them into the Q&A box, and we will address them at the very end of the presentation, very end of the program after Peter's presentation. If you have any comments for Peter, you can type those into the chat, and I'll make sure to relay everything to him before we wrap up. All right, so I did want to thank the Corning Foundation for sponsoring tonight's event. They're based out of here in Tewksbury, Corning Life Sciences. So we appreciate them funding this event and other virtual author events this summer and this fall. So it's my pleasure to introduce a best-selling author, Peter Zheutlin, for a presentation on his new book, Spin. Spin is a novel based on a mostly true story. A little bit about the book. Right away on a round-the-world adventure of a lifetime with only a change of clothes and a pearl-handed revolver in this transcendent novel inspired by the life of Annie Londonderry. Who was Annie? She captured the popular imagination with her daring around-the-world trip on two wheels. It was, according to the New York World in October of 1895, quote, the most extraordinary journey ever undertaken by a woman, unquote. But beyond the headlines, Londonderry was really Annie Cohen Kopchovsky, a young Jewish mother of three small children who climbed onto a 42-pound Columbia bicycle and pedaled away into history. Peter, who is a descendant of Annie, brilliantly probes the inner life and seemingly boundless courage of this outlandish, brash, and charismatic woman. So in this novel Spin, this remarkable heroine and her marvelous stranger-than-fiction story is vividly brought to life for a new generation. So just a few sentences about Peter. Peter Zheutlin is the author of the New York Times bestseller Rescue Road, One Man, 30,000 Dogs, and a Million Miles on the Lost Hope Highway. Also written Rescued, What Second Chance Dogs Teach Us About Living with Purpose. He also wrote Loving with a Oh, no, that's the entire... You love your subtitles, I'll tell you, Peter.
I don't make them.
You don't, yeah, okay. So Living with Purpose, Loving with Abandon, and Finding Journey in the Little Things. As well as his recent book that he spoke here virtually, I believe, last year, The Dog Went Over the Mountain, Travels with Albie, An American Journey. Let's see. And that book, congratulations, Peter, was a Lowell Thomas Society of American Traveler Writers Award winner. All right, so Peter lives in Massachusetts with his wife, author Judy Gelman. So hopefully I didn't butcher that too badly. Again, want to thank the Corning Foundation for their generosity. So everyone here watching live on Zoom and those that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Peter for joining us here tonight. And Peter, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Robert. And it's good to be back at the Tewksbury Public Library, which this evening looks a lot like my bedroom. But this is my third, I think, visit with you. And thanks also to the Corning Foundation for supporting this series. That description of the book that Robert read, I just want to assure everyone, I didn't write it. It sounds like it was written by a real estate agent, but I appreciate you reading it anyway. So I want to do three things tonight. I want to tell you all the story behind the story, how it is that I came to write this book. And then I want to tell you a little bit about the social and historical context in which this real-life woman took this remarkable journey around the world. And then third, I want to tell you a bit about her journey itself. How did this all start for me? As Robert mentioned, I'm a descendant of Annie's, but this story was not passed down to me through my family. It all started in 1993 with a letter from a complete stranger, written to my mother, which she shared with me, from someone who told us he was researching the story of the first woman to bicycle around the world. And in the letter, he told us her real name, Annie Cohen Kopchovsky was her married name, and he explained that he had done some genealogical research, and that led him to suspect that my mother might be related to her. And as he laid it out, it was quite clear. This was, in fact, a family member. But my mother had never heard of her. She showed it to me and so, asked me if I would respond to this gentleman on her behalf. I explained that he had clearly found the right family based on the information he had provided, but we had absolutely knew nothing about her or anything about this bicycle ride. And that's where it sat from 1993 for 10 years. And in 2003, I opened the folder. I had saved his letter, and he had enclosed a couple of newspaper articles about her journey, which he had found from, one was from a Boston newspaper, another was from an Omaha newspaper, and I had just stuck this stuff away for 10 years. Then in 2003, this same fellow wrote to me and said, gee, I dropped this project. I couldn't get anywhere. I just wonder if you've learned anything in the 10 years that have passed. And I had, during those 10 years, always asked family members when we saw older members of the family in particular, if they'd ever heard of her, and everybody drew a complete blank. And I really began to wonder, why was a woman in our family who had done such a remarkable thing completely unknown within our family? And I decided to start poking around a little bit myself. I knew from one of the newspaper articles that was enclosed in that original letter that this trip had started on the steps of the Massachusetts State House, our capital in Boston. And so my first call was to the State House Library. And the woman who happened to answer the phone, a librarian named Ava Murphy, when I told her what I was interested in, to see if they had any record or photograph of this event, she didn't even hesitate. She said, oh, I know we don't have anything about her. And I thought, well, how would she know that right off the bat without even looking? And she said, well, I had an inquiry about this same woman several weeks ago from a man in Texas. And I thought, well, that's rather peculiar. There was nothing on the internet about her at all. I wondered, who is this guy in Texas who's pursuing her? It was not the letter writer. He was from Massachusetts. I said, well, can you put me in touch with this guy? And she said, well, I'll see if he wants to talk to you. She said he definitely wanted to hear from me. I sent him an email, and his name is Dennis McCown, and he wrote back, you can see, oh my God, a relative of Annie Londonderry's. We quickly established, I initially thought maybe he was a long-lost relative, but we quickly established that he wasn't. And of course, I wanted to know what the nature of his interest was. How did he find out about her, and why was he interested in researching her story? And I'm going to tell you now what he told me. And you're going to wonder where this is going, but I assure you it's going to an interesting destination. Dennis, who lives near Austin, he was actually researching a completely different story. He was researching an ancestor of his own, a woman named Helen Beulah Morose, who lived in El Paso, Texas in the 1890s. Helen was married to a ne'er-do-well named Martin Morose, who had been arrested in El Paso on a cattle rustling charge. I told you you're going to wonder why this is relevant. Just stay with me. Martin, to escape the law, had fled across the river into Juarez, Mexico, and his wife, Helen, sought to hire a lawyer for him, and she hired a lawyer by the name of John Wesley Hardin. I don't know if you can see the whole caption or if I'm blocking it. John Wesley Hardin, in his younger days, was the most feared gunslinger of the Old West, and he had served more than half of his life in prison, had murdered by his own account about 24 men, starting when he was in his teens, and he was now set up practicing law in El Paso, believe it or not. So she hired John Wesley Hardin to represent her husband, but they immediately fell into a torrid love affair. And on a night in July of 1895, 4 men, all law enforcement officers in El Paso, paid by Hardin, lured Martin Morose back across the border and murdered him outside of El Paso on this summer night. So Dennis is telling me all this, and like you, I'm saying, okay, this is really interesting, but what's the connection to my aunt? And he said, I wanted to find out where was John Wesley Hardin on the night of this murder, because he paid for it, but he wasn't at the scene. And what he found in his research was that John Wesley Hardin and his lover, Helen, were that evening listening to a lecture by a young woman from Boston going around the world on a bicycle. When I heard this story, and I thought that my Jewish great-grandaunt had managed to cross paths with the most famous outlaw of the Old West, I was absolutely hooked on this story. I said, I've got to figure this out. I've got to learn more. This is just too fantastic to just let it slide. So that's how I got drawn in to this story. Now, how did I start to piece Annie's trip together? Because I had no family information to go on. Her story was completely, nothing on the internet. What Dennis had provided me with several newspaper articles from the El Paso newspapers that covered Annie's visit there about a year into her trip in early July of 1895. And one of them contained an important clue. It said that she had left El Paso riding north along the Santa Fe railway tracks, because riders in those days would hew closely to the tracks so they wouldn't get lost in these great distances out west. And so I was able to find a map of the old Santa Fe, and I literally began calling librarians in every little town along the railway and asked them to search their newspapers, their historic newspapers. I gave them a time frame, and little by little, I was able to start putting little pins in a map to plot her route out of El Paso. While I was doing that painstaking research, and keep in mind at that point, old newspapers, very few of them were searchable online, many of them more are now, I took another tack. Because I had found out in one of the early newspaper accounts in New York, and it was one of the only newspaper accounts out of probably 1,000 that I've collected, said that she was a married mother with 3 small children, which I found absolutely astonishing, that she not only was making this bike trip around the world, but had left a husband and 3 small children behind. And when I read that, I thought, I've got to find out if any of those children had children of their own, because if they did, they might still be alive. And so I hired a genealogist who specialized in Jewish genealogy to see if I could track down a direct living descendant of Annie's who might know more. Robert, I don't know if I can stack these so I'm not blocking people's view. Let me see.
So actually, Peter, the way that I think, the way I'm viewing you, and I think the way others are viewing you, you're not in the way of it.
Okay. So I'm not only trying to piece together this bicycle trip, but I'm trying to figure out who was this woman. So she was born Annie Cohen. That's my mother's maiden name. She was the sister of my great-grandfather Bennett, who was my mother's grandfather. She came here with two older siblings, and her parents in the mid-1870s emigrated here from near Riga in Latvia. So she came to Boston as a young girl. By 1888, at the tender age of 17 or 18, she was married to a man named Max Kopchovsky. And she had, one of the other things I learned early on, that she had never ridden a bicycle before undertaking to ride one around the world. And as I mentioned, the working mother of three children, very tender age, that she left behind. And we'll talk about the implications of that. It was a pretty tough and harsh decision for her kids. One newspaper called her an inventive genius. She was, in fact, a brilliant self-promoter, which is why I have probably close to 1,000 newspaper articles about her from all over the world, and a masterful creator of her own myth with a very casual relationship with the truth, which is why, by the way, Spin is subtitled based on a mostly true story, because as you're going to see, she was writing a lot of her own fiction in real time. So at various times on this journey, as she spoke to reporters, and she had a very modern sense of celebrity, she knew how to entertain reporters, she knew how to get ink, and she made up a lot of stories about herself and where she'd been because she wanted to sensationalize this trip, because she understood what the masters of Silicon Valley understand well today, is that attention equaled money, and she had to earn her way around the world. As she traveled at various times, to give you an idea of her creative genius, she claimed to be a Harvard medical student. I was pretty gullible when I first read this, and I actually called Harvard Medical School looking for her transcript, only to be told that Harvard didn't admit women to the medical school until 1947, some 50 years later. She claimed to be a lawyer, an accountant, a wealthy heiress. She told people she was an orphan from a young age, that she had invented a new type of stenography, that she had founded a newspaper, that she was a cousin of a congressman and the niece of a senator. None of this was true. But she was always reinventing herself to suit the moment, to make herself, an interesting character for the news people. So when I started to gather all this information about her, I decided to write a first book about her, which was nonfiction. And early on, I thought what I was doing as I researched her story was that I was going to document the story of the first woman to go around the world on a bicycle. But there came a point in this research when I began to realize that her stories weren't really adding up. They were inconsistent. The time she was making across Asia was much too fast for a woman on a bicycle. And at first I was kind of disappointed. I thought, oh my gosh, she really, did she really ride around the world, or what's going on here? I eventually came to embrace her because I realized what I had on my hands was a more interesting character than I initially thought. This wasn't just a woman, who showed some physical mettle and mental fortitude in making this journey, and she did make a journey around the world, somewhat on bicycle, we'll come to that. But she just was a much more complex and interesting character than I had first assumed. And so in the first book, I started to sort out the fact from the fiction and to try and determine what really happened. And I had a couple of publishers at that time suggest to me that I write the book as historical fiction because the historical record was somewhat thin and inconsistent. But since I was trying to bring back to life a story that had been lost for more than a century, I didn't want to do that. I wanted the real story to be out there, even if the real story involved her fabrications about herself and her life. So that book was published back in 2007. A couple of years ago, to my surprise, this obituary about her ran belatedly in the New York Times. If you read the New York Times, you may know that over the last few years, they've been doing a series of obits called Overlooked. And these are people, mainly people of color and women, who the Times, in retrospect, feels that they overlooked in their day. And so this obituary appeared. A lot of it relied on that first book. And I was stunned. And as soon as my wife saw this, my wife was very plugged into the book club world around the country for her business, and because she promotes books. And she looked at this and she said, you have to write this story as historical fiction because that's what my book clubs want to read. And if you don't do it, somebody else will. And you've already done all the research. So you're way ahead of the game. So when my wife Judy tells me to do something, I try to do it. I had no experience writing fiction. I'd only written 8 previous books. They were all nonfiction. So I thought I'd humor her. I'd write 20 pages. I'd send it to my agent. She'd tell me it was no good and we'd be done with it. But long story short, she liked it and it became the book Spin. So let me tell you a little bit about Annie's, the milieu from which she came and the social historical context for this journey. The old West End of Boston, where her family settled in the 1870s, where Massachusetts General Hospital is now. This neighborhood, by the way, was largely demolished in the urban renewal wave of the mid-20th century. It was the most ethnically diverse neighborhood in the United States. There were Irish, there were African Americans, there were Jews, Germans, Poles, you name it. And a young girl with some imagination who lived in this community would have heard many languages spoken. On summer days when the windows were thrown open to catch a breeze and people were cooking, she would have smelled, the pierogies from the families, the Polish kitchens and the pastas from the Italian kitchens. It could have fired the imagination of a young woman curious about the world beyond the Charles River. Now, as I mentioned, she was married at a very young age, and by the time she was in her early 20s, had 3 young children. The next picture, the next image, is from Punch magazine the year after her trip. I don't know that she inspired it specifically, but it absolutely, in one image, sums up her life. 3 small children, an Orthodox Jewish husband at home, and she's not happy in this life. She's not particularly maternal. There's a lot of drudgery. She also has a job working outside the home. She's the primary breadwinner, actually, selling advertising for the Boston newspapers as an advertising solicitor. So this picture, in a sense, I think sums up what it was happening in her life at the time. And women were taking to bicycles in big numbers, and we're going to come to that as well. But what set her in motion besides this sort of curiosity about the larger world? It was reported consistently all over the world in newspapers from San Francisco to Saigon that what set Annie in motion was a wager between 2 wealthy Boston industrialists who were debating one of the biggest political questions of the day, which was the equality of women and whether women should have the right to vote and should work outside the home. And women were agitating for social and economic equality and the right to vote. So that was a big issue. So 2 men wagered $20,000 to $10,000 that a woman could not make it around the world on a bicycle, which only a man had done to date. There were conditions. She had to circle the world in 15 months, which made it a race against the clock. She had to cover 10,000 miles on a bicycle. She had to start without a penny in her pocket and earn, these are big sums in those days, $5,000 en route. Now, why this condition? This was not supposed to be just a test of a woman's physical endurance and mental fortitude. It was also going to test a woman's ability to defend for herself in the world. If she succeeded, she was to win a $10,000 prize, and there were other conditions added along the way. And when I say that, what I mean is that when it was convenient for Annie, she would tell reporters that there were other conditions. For example, one reporter who I think was quite smitten with her, she told she was not allowed to contract matrimony during the trip, probably a way to fend off his advances, even though she was married with 3 kids. She claimed that that she spoke fluent French, but she wasn't allowed to speak French in France. That wasn't true. It was just a way to save face. There were many other examples of that. Now, this trip took place at the intersection of 3 of the most dynamic and powerful social currents of the day, and Annie built her fame at their intersection. I want to just go through them briefly. One, this was an early stage of globalization. The telegraph enabled news to travel around the world in a matter of hours. You could sail from New York to Paris or to the north coast of France in less than a week. So the world was figuratively shrinking in the late 1800s, and people were very curious about the larger world fueled by these developments. Second, the bicycle craze of the 1890s. Millions of Americans and Europeans were taking to bicycles. In this time, particularly, the sport was opening up to women. People were just crazy about the bicycle. And third was this women's movement that I mentioned, women agitating for equality and suffrage, referred to collectively in the press as the new woman. So I want to address each of these briefly. If Annie's trip has echoes that sound familiar, well, it's very similar to the story of Jules Verne and Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days, which sort of captured this ethos of globalization that was taking place in the late 1800s. You may remember that the main character, Phileas Fogg, responds to a wager by two men at a club in London and says he can make it around the world in 80 days using conventional means of transportation. And so that wager sets Phileas Fogg en route. Now that trip in turn inspired several other round-the-world trips, not necessarily Thomas Stevens, but I wanted to tell you that Thomas Stevens was the first person around the world on a bicycle. It took 3 years. But Nellie Bly, the most famous journalist of her day, male or female, as a publicity stunt for the New York World newspaper, set out to break Jules Verne's fictional record, the Around the World in 80 Days, as a publicity stunt for the New York World in 1889 and 1890. And she made it in 75 days, writing about it in serial form for the New York World, and it was a huge sensation. They ran a contest. You would enter to guess how long it would take her. It drew millions of entries. And Nellie Bly is going to figure in this story again, but she became so famous for this that there was a board game that sold popularly after this trip to celebrate that race around the world. So you can trace the sort of lineage of Annie's trip back several decades. As I mentioned, this was also the era when bicycling was becoming an absolute craze. Now, until the late 1880s, bicycles looked like these. Very difficult to ride, very difficult just to get on them, and very few women did. But as and this is one of the reasons, they were very difficult to ride. But as bicycles came to resemble what we now are familiar with, this geometry, they were called safety bicycles because they were safer. This opened the sport to women as never before, and women seized the opportunity. The bicycle became both a symbol and a practical application of women's desire for greater freedom. It challenged every Victorian convention about what was proper for women to do. To be seen riding in the Boston Garden or Boston Common with your ankles showing and exerting yourself and sweating was just absolutely abhorrent to many people in those days. So the moral propriety of cycling for women was hotly debated in the 1890s. Even some doctors got in the act. Some said that women would become infertile from riding a bicycle. It sounds bizarre today, but this was seriously argued in those days. The bicycle also brought about changes in the way women dressed, and Annie's going to be a perfect example, and we'll see it as she goes, how her dress evolved to become more practical for cycling. So getting a bicycle was a woman's declaration of independence. Advertisers, very keen to capitalize on this market, though they promoted the bicycle not only as a freedom machine, but as a celebration of femininity. And you can see it in these advertising posters of the day. These are not masculine women taking to the bicycle. They're literally goddesses. And so this is how bicycles were sold to women in the day. And the bicycle then became a symbol of the women's suffrage movement. Frances Willard, the founder of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who learned to ride a bike at the age of 53, wrote that she learned to ride a bike because she wanted to take, quote, this implement of power and literally put it at my feet. And Susan B. Anthony famously said, literally, this was an interview just months after Annie got back from her trip, and it was an interview with Nellie Bly. She said that bicycling had done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. So that brings us to the journey itself. Annie's had her bicycle lessons. She has not done a whole lot of preparation for this trip. She's informed her husband and my great-grandfather Bennett, who with his wife and their two small kids are going to have a lot of responsibility for taking care of Annie's kids. But there are 500 people gathered at the State House to see her off, including a representative from the Columbia Bicycle Company, owned by Colonel Albert Pope, that provided the Columbia bicycle, 42-pound bike, on which she would begin the trip. When I mentioned earlier, I had hired a genealogist, and about a year into my research, we did find Annie's only direct living descendant, her granddaughter Mary, who's my second cousin once removed. I wrote to Mary, I won't go through all of it, but to explain who I was and why I was interested in this story, and I didn't know if I would ever hear from her. I thought she might wonder who I was and what I was up to. But she was delighted, and we ended up meeting a week later. And this was the first photograph I ever saw of Annie after chasing her for more than a year around the world, figuratively speaking. And I had read that she had had a formal portrait taken at a place called the Town Studio in Boston. Mary had this photograph in a frame, but the bottom was covered. And when she took it out of the frame and I saw where it was taken, I knew this was the photograph I had actually read about. But we talked about the clothing. These are the clothes that she started a bicycle trip around the world in, if you can imagine riding in such clothing, on a 42-pound bicycle, which is a behemoth by modern standards. It had a very ineffective brake. I'm going to show you a close-up now of the rear wheel. As I mentioned earlier, her name was Annie Cohen, but she became famous by the name Annie Londonderry. And so where did that name come from and why? Annie she was an advertising solicitor. She had a very advanced notion, as I said, of celebrity. So she actually solicited advertising sponsors, corporate sponsors for this journey. And the first was the Londonderry Spring Water Company of Nashua, New Hampshire. The spring itself was actually in the town of Londonderry. And so in exchange for $100, remember she had to earn her way around, in exchange for $100, she affixed this placard to the back of the bicycle. The screen mesh that you see was called a skirt guard. It was designed to keep a woman's skirts from getting caught up in the spokes. And she called herself Annie Londonderry. So, she pioneered sports-related marketing for women, among other things. The name served another purpose, not just a commercial purpose. Her names were quite obviously Jewish. And I think she was smart enough to realize it would ease her passage in many parts of the world to be traveling under an assumed name that was not so identifiable. But you can see here's an example of how the water company capitalized on her growing fame about a little more than a year into her trip. This advertisement appeared in the Denver newspapers when she arrived in Denver. And you can see the drawing is based on one of those photographs. This is how her departure from Boston was described in the Boston Evening Transcript. I love this description. And then carrying only a change of clothes and a pearl-handled revolver, Miss Londonderry sailed away like a kite down Beacon Street. She did, in fact, carry a revolver. She showed it to many reporters. Again, she was all about making a sensation out of herself, and this added a lot of drama. She said, she expected to encounter a lot of danger, and her stories were filled with daring do and a lot of dangerous encounters, many of which were fanciful. I suspect she had less experience with a pistol than she had even with a bicycle. But nonetheless, that's what happened. Her first stop was New York, made her way down through Rhode Island to New York, Connecticut to New York City, lingered there for an entire month, even though this 15-month clock was ticking, making contact with the newspapers there and fiddling with her dresses to make them more practical for riding. We'll come to that in a moment. This is how she was depicted in the New York World newspaper when she was in New York. To get to Chicago, and again, she did little advanced planning. Think of your geography. She rides from Boston to New York and then up to Albany and then west to Chicago using a road book. This is a very detailed booklet that you could buy from the League of American Wheelmen to literally give you turn-by-turn instructions for cyclists all the way from New York to Chicago. But why would she ride to New York, then up to Albany and across? She could have made it to Albany from Boston in a couple of days. Well, if you think about it, she got to Albany. She could follow the Erie Canal, the path, what they call the tow path. These are the paths that the teams of oxen would pull the barges down the Erie Canal. So it was flat riding across New York. But she arrives in Chicago 3 months after she started. It takes her 3 months just to get to Chicago. She's not in great shape. She's wearing these cumbersome clothes. She's got a very heavy bicycle. And she decides to give it up in Chicago. And she tells the press she's not going to continue. She'll never get across the Great Plains and the Mountain West, in time. So she says she's going to just go back to New York and try and set a speed record back to New York. That's her cover story. But things change in Chicago yet again. What happens in Chicago that makes her change her mind and decide she is going to try and make it around the world? Well, one is that she makes contact with a bicycle company called Sterling, and they offer her a 21-pound bicycle, half the weight she's been, trying to move across the countryside. Makes a big difference. This photograph of that bicycle was made in San Francisco, and it had no brake, a single gear, and that American flag that you see on it was given to her by a diplomat in Paris who told her to carry it for her protection. So she gets this new bicycle. It weighs 21 pounds, as I said. And she also decides to change her clothes. And she realizes that she'll wear bloomers, which will be much more comfortable for riding. So she's got to push half the weight. She's now in much more comfortable clothes. So she kind of gets a second wind, so to speak. But as I said, it's too late for her to keep heading west. So she decides she's going to go back to New York and make this circuit around the world traveling eastward, essentially negating 3 months of this 15 months. Except now she only has to get back to Chicago to claim that she's made a circuit of the earth. As she begins to ride back east, she starts to pick up escorts. Her fame is beginning to grow. She's very astute about notifying newspapers and cycling clubs. There were many cycling clubs all across the country. So she finds escorts that take her, kind of ride with her relay style in between cities. And because her fame is growing, she's able to sell more advertising on her bicycle, which she attaches to her bicycle and literally sews onto her clothing rides around a city like Buffalo for a couple of days, and advertisers, literally, she rented different parts of her body for different amounts of money. This picture from one of the Buffalo newspapers, the only photograph of her that I ever found that appeared in a newspaper, you can't quite see it, but the reason that her arm looks like it's white is that's an advertising banner that she has stitched on to her left arm. And this is how she's going to make some of the $5,000 she's committed to making. I'm skipping over a lot, obviously in the interest of time, but she gets back to New York City, sails to the north coast of France, and begins a trip down to Paris and ends up eventually in Marseille. Again, she was a huge celebrity in France. The newspaper coverage was voluminous, and she's escorted almost every mile of the way by cyclists from various cities. But what was particularly interesting, what happens when she gets to France, is how the tenor of the newspaper coverage changes. As you can see from this portrait made in Chicago, she was an attractive young woman, and she was always described that way, sometimes by modern standards, inappropriately so, as quite attractive and shapely and beautiful. But she did not conform to French notions of femininity, and she was by this time more muscular. This is a quote from a newspaper in Lyon, which sort of sums up the way she was described in France. It said she belongs to that category of neutered beings, single women without a husband or children, little did they know. The suppression of love and maternal function so profoundly alters in them any feminine personality. They're neither men nor women, and really constitute a third sex. Annie was challenging. I mean, she was a gender bending experience for people in this age. She was now dressed more like a man in her bloomers. She was riding a man's bicycle. If you remember that Sterling was a men's frame bicycle, and she's more muscular. And so this is the way the French tend to see her. In this illustration, you can see she's more masculine looking. And those are advertisements that you can see stitched on her knee and on her hip. So she makes her way south through France in a cold winter. There's some wonderful stories by men who rode with her that I mentioned in both books. Annie then boards a steamship in Marseille, and she's on the same steamship when it arrives on the coast of Japan 6 weeks later. This is what led me to conclude that she didn't ride across China and Asia as she often claimed. She was skipping like a stone over the water. But she knew that when she came back to the States, she wanted to have a really dynamic lecture presentation she could give as she traveled across the United States. And the war between China and Japan over Korea was winding down. It was a brutal, brutal war, covered widely in the American newspapers. So she decided she would be a witness to the war. I can tell you that most of what she told about the war in her lectures was from her own imagination. And this is an example. When she wrote the only first-person account of her trip for the New York World when she returned, this was how she described her experience at the front. And you can see how she fed the sensationalist impulses of the newspapers of the day. While thus imprisoned, she claims to have been taken prisoner. A Japanese soldier killed a Chinese prisoner and drank his blood before, all this gory, graphic stuff. I tell people that the New York World is what you would get if the New York Times had acquired the National Enquirer. And they had a great thirst, and the readers had a great thirst for this kind of sensationalism. She travels again by steamship, obviously, to San Francisco, where she arrives in early spring. This is how she's depicted on her arrival in San Francisco. To give you an idea how cavalier she was about her own story, on the same day, two different newspapers in San Francisco were told two completely different accounts by her of how she got across Asia. She told one reporter about the long, arduous journey across India and China, and she told another that she took the boat. She really didn't much care about sticking to a single coherent story. She just wanted the attention. And she had this photograph taken outside of San Francisco that she used to illustrate her lectures. These are in the form of what are called lantern slides. These are glass slides. And one of the treasures that I found at Mary's house, her granddaughter's house, in the basement, was 75 of these glass slides that Annie had collected on her trip and shipped from point to point. And they were still intact in Mary's basement, including this one of Annie that she had staged outside of San Francisco. Some were those scenes of like the battlefront. These were slides that you could have purchased like postcards. But I want you to note something in the picture. Look at what she's wearing. She's not even in bloomers anymore. She's now riding in a man's suit. So when she's going to arrive in towns like Tucson and Phoenix, so I don't know who's on from Phoenix. It might be my high school classmate, Patrice. When she arrives in these towns, keep in mind, Phoenix had 3,000 people then. Tucson had 5,000. Most of these people lived their whole lives in these places. She came bearing tales of adventure, dressed as a man, riding a man's bicycle, and banners and advertisements covering her body. She didn't run away to join the circus. She became the circus. So I'm going to wrap up in the next couple of minutes. So very briefly, she takes 6 weeks riding to Los Angeles in the company of a young male cyclist named Mark Johnson. I have some speculation about that relationship in the novel. In the novel, I was free to invent parts of the story. This is how the New York World depicted her crossing the desert in Arizona in the article that she wrote for them after her trip. And there are a few things to note about this, because it might seem almost fanciful here. The expanses out west were so great and the scenery in every direction looked the same, that the only way to safely go from place to place was to literally follow the railway tracks. Otherwise, you could be out and get lost in the middle of the desert. And if you broke down, it might be a couple of days, but eventually a train would come by. And sometimes when the ground was impassable, long-distance cyclists literally rode the rails like this, a pretty uncomfortable journey. But the other thing I want to call your attention to at the bottom is to look at the caption. The byline for this article was Nellie Bly Jr. We talked about Nellie Bly earlier. Nellie Bly, the most famous journalist of her day, in a big falling out with her editors at the New York World. That's an interesting history in and of itself. But Annie was being groomed to become the next Nellie Bly, and she did for some time after the bicycle trip for several months. Did, in a sense, succeed Nellie Bly as the great sensation writer, female sensation writer for the New York World. This led her to El Paso, by the way, in the events I told you about. But this is the headline from that full-page first-person account of her trip from the New York World, around the world on a bicycle. Nellie Bly Jr. again, most extraordinary journey ever undertaken by a woman. And you can see the sensationalism about her being taken prisoner, and a diary of 15 months in all parts of the globe in her bloomers. This is how she opened that story. I'm a new woman, if that term means I believe I can do anything that any man can do. When I met Mary, one of my questions for her was whether she thought of her grandmother as a feminist. She said, she wasn't a feminist in the sense that she was out petitioning for equal rights or protesting or marching with the suffragists. She wasn't an activist by any stretch of the imagination. But she donned the mantle of the women's movement because it served her purposes. But Mary said to me, she was a feminist in that she believed in a woman's right to control and her own destiny and to write her own story, which she very much did. When she returned after 15 months, she and Max, they remained married all their lives. This is them probably in the mid-1940s, shortly before their deaths. His the year before hers. And a fourth child born after the bicycle trip, who was Mary's mother. So the only child of Annie's who had a child of her own was the one who was not essentially abandoned for 15 months for this bicycle trip. This bicycle trip had serious consequences for these children. I deal with it in both books. I won't necessarily talk about it now unless there are questions. So that's the story very briefly. The book is Spin. You can get it pretty much anywhere. And if you read it and you like it, please review it on Amazon. It really helps us authors. If you don't like it, I'll give you my email address. You can write to me directly. But thanks so much for your attention. And if there are questions, let's dive in.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Still waiting on questions. I'll give folks 60 seconds to type any in that they may have. If you have any comments or questions for Peter, now is certainly the time. Peter, while we're waiting for a question or two, what are you up to now? Have you moved on to your next project, or are you too busy still promoting this one?
Well, I'm promoting this one. I don't actually have another one in mind, although I touched on it. Annie's brief career as a newspaper woman after this trip, she wrote, in the tradition of Nellie Bly, a lot of sensational features for the New York World. She went out to New Jersey to write about a self-proclaimed messiah who was leading a commune. She went undercover to, these were all things that were way overhyped. There was a matchmaking service in New York for lonely hearts, and she went, quote unquote, undercover to sort of, expose their kind of machinations and so forth. She visited an all-female stock exchange off of Wall Street. So she had this brief chapter in her life after the bike trip, which I've toyed with the idea of seeing if that's might be novel-worthy. Now that I've proven to myself that I can actually write a novel, which I didn't think I could do.
Right. Great. Well, Peter, we have a shy group with us tonight. I don't see any questions in the Q&A box. This happens from time to time. No worries. So, Peter, do you want to, any last words before we wrap up for the evening?
No, I just, I hope people enjoy the story. I would say this. I've had a number of book groups who've read it, and I've joined them. If you have a book group and you're interested in reading it, contact me through the website. It's annielondonderry.com. I'd be happy to join you by Zoom or on the phone. But I think one of the things that has been interesting for book groups as they've read this is to try and figure out on their own what's real and what's not. What's fiction and what's not fiction. As I mentioned, I was writing historical fiction about a woman who was writing her own historical fiction in real time. So parts of the story are demonstrably true. The arc of the story is absolutely true. But there are parts of it that Annie made up, and there are parts of it that I made up in my role as a novelist to sort of bring life to this story in a way that you couldn't simply by sticking to the known facts. Interactions with people, dialogue, relationships. So there's a lot of material in this book that would fall into the category of plausible but not provable.
Sure. Well, great. Well, Harriet in the chat says that she thought your book was very interesting. So thanks for the comment there, Harriet. And just a note, I certainly encourage folks to purchase a copy of Peter's book. And if you can do so through an independent bookstore, that's even better. I would note, however, that the library does own a copy. So if you want to borrow it from the library, you can come on down and do so. So with that, I will be, just a reminder, check your email tomorrow morning with a link to a feedback survey and a link to this recording. And with that, thank the Corning Foundation, thank everyone for attending, and most of all, thank Peter for a great presentation. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their evening. So thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep,
Take
thanks,
care.
Peter.
Be
Bye-bye.
well. Bye-bye.
Bye all.